In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit, one God, amen. So as you guys know, this Sunday is Thomas Sunday. So we want to talk a little bit about that event. But the first thing, we'll talk about just generally there's a resurrection. And as you all know, we all say to each other what? When we greet each other. Christ is risen. Christos anesti. Who knows it in Coptic? Becherestos avtonf. Very good. All right, and then what do you say back? Chenometh mi avtonf, right? And so we say Christos anesti, elithos anesti in Greek. And in English we say Christ is risen, truly he is risen. And this is one of the things we do for the next 50 days. And so the church really wants us to focus during the next 50 days, obviously on the resurrection. Why is that? Right? Well, because obviously the resurrection is really important. It's a quintessential event of Christ's life. Okay, the church does lots of things to get us to focus. Everything we do is Christos anesti, right? If there's a wedding, instead of coming in with the normal hymn, O King of Peace, we say Christ is risen. If there's a funeral, instead of coming in sad, we say Christ is risen. If there's a baptism, Christ is risen. Everything, all the hymns get changed to Christ is risen. Okay, and the church wants us to constantly focus on this. In fact, we're not allowed to fast, which is why we're having In and Out right now on a Wednesday, right? You're actually not allowed to fast. You're not allowed to do a matanya by force, okay? So the church is really pushing you. These are extreme measures, aren't they? Right? Now, why would the church take such an extreme measure? Well, they're trying to take you down. That's right, Jason. It's the man is trying to keep you down. Yeah. No, and this is actually a very important point, because what a lot of people say is my spirituality was so good during Lent, and then during the 50 days it just crashes. Okay? And the reason we and then we get upset. We're like, if only I could maintain Lent. Okay. Now, the point of having seasons in a church, right? And the point and we learn about seasons even from nature, right? God created seasons, right? Because summer's great, okay, but it's not all summer unless you're in LA, okay. And then fall has got its own characteristics, and winter everything has its own, and nature and botany requires seasons, right? There has to be a lot of rain, and there has to be a lot of sun, and there has to be cold where the tree dies, right? All of these things happen for a reason. The human being isn't just able to sustain spiritual life. It kind of gets boring, right? It's very hard to just be the same. So the church realizes that we kind of need ups and downs. That's just kind of the human cycle, right? We need a period of time when we're like, you know what? For the next 3 months, I'm really going to get into it. Okay? We do that. We do that with dieting. We do that with studying. We do that with everything, right? Where we just pick a time. We say, okay, these 3 months are the time we were going to focus. And then these 3 months, we want you to focus on something else, right? We don't want you, forgive me, right? We don't want you to be super repentant. We don't want you to be doing matanyas and saying, woe is me, and I'm a sinner. That was for Lent. Now I want you to say, Christ is risen. We have victory, right? We went through Lent. We went through the crucifixion, and now rejoice. The church wants you to rejoice. Every tune we say is festive, regardless of when it is, right? That's a very strong message, the church. You're not allowed to fast. You're not allowed to do a matanya. Those are very strong messages the church is sending you. There's not just rituals that we go through, right? The church really wants you to say, no, don't think about that stuff. Christ is risen. That's everything. He defeated death, and we're in him. We defeated death with him. Focus on that. You can't be killed. I heard a sermon once by Abuna Daud Lamay, and he's so funny, but he says, if we put a big sign on our church, and we say, we figured out a way to beat death, right? And, as soon as you die, whoever you are, you close your eyes, you're just going to open them back up again. And we sold it for $5 million. There'd be a line out the door for people trying to pay the $5 million to defeat death, right? I mean, and, you guys married, maybe too young, right? But this is, lots of people do this, right? Like Michael Jackson used to do these oxygen chambers. Anyone hear about this? Or are you guys too young, right? And it's because he didn't want to die. He wanted a prolonged life, right? In fact, you see these very funny like memes and stuff like, there's a tombstone, and on the tombstone it says, "I ate all that kale for nothing," right? I mean, everyone's health crazy, and there's whole industries built around health and anti-aging and anti-whatever. Guess what? It doesn't work, right? Take all the anti-aging you want. You age and then you die, right? Doesn't matter, and you see people eating like nut jobs, super healthy, super whatever, and you're like, what are you doing? Why? So anyway, and he basically said the lines would be out the door if we offered this, because everyone's trying not to die. And he's like, and yet we can't fill a Bible study with people because nobody wants to come, right? So when you think about it like that, this is why the church is so focused on Christos Anesti, right? Christ has defeated death. Death, where is your sting? Death, where is your victory? Right? We talked about this, I know, during the Holy Week sermon. But let's talk about St. Thomas. First of all, it's called Thomas Sunday because it's the week that Thomas doubted. And so the gospel says on the evening of that first day of the week, which is again Sunday, and you all know that what's the Sabbath? Which day is the Sabbath?
Friday.
Saturday, right? So the seventh day is Saturday, which is why the Jews have the Sabbath as the day of rest, right? And so Sunday is the first day of the week, and it's also the what? Eighth day of the week, right? And so the church always thinks of the number 8 as the new beginning, right? Because the 7 is a number of perfection and completeness, right? God created the whole world in 7 days, so that's perfection, completeness, right? 7 is a number of completeness, okay? And then 8 is a new beginning. It starts over, right? And so the Sunday is both the first day and the 8th day, right? And that's why in the church, sometimes you'll see a baptismal font that has 8 sides, an octagon. There'll be a church, and there's a church in Michigan that I went to, is an octagon, right? So an octagon is actually a common shape in the church because it symbolizes a new beginning, right? And so that's why when Christ resurrected, he resurrected on the 8th day, right? It's a new beginning, right? He started a new creation. He recreated the creation, right? Okay. So it says on the evening, all that to say, the first day of the week, the disciples were gathered together. So a week later, they were gathered together. The doors were locked for fear of the Jewish leaders. And then Jesus came and stood among them and said, "Peace be to you." And after he said that, he showed them his hands and side. And the disciples were overjoyed when they saw the Lord. And then we all know the rest of the story. Thomas wasn't there. And then, they came back, and Thomas came back, and they said, "We saw Jesus." They're like, "I don't believe it. I got to see his hands, and I got to see the nail prints in his hands and feet." How you doing? And then Jesus reappeared to Thomas, just for Thomas, and then he said, "My Lord and my God." All right, so we can all see that the disciples weren't in great shape, right? They were all fearful. They were all scared of the Jews, okay? And it's clear they saw the resurrection. They saw Christ. They heard about it from the Marys, right? But they didn't internalize the resurrection, right? I mean, obviously, it's a pretty weird event, right? Someone coming back from the dead, not something we see very often. Okay, so I get it. Okay, so simply put, like the resurrection for them was intellectual, and maybe they intellectually like, well, yeah, maybe he rose from the dead, right? But it wasn't in them. It wasn't in their hearts, right? And so when the resurrection becomes a thing that Jesus did, and it's not my thing, well, then it's less interesting, right? So like for us, the resurrection, why is the resurrection such an important event for us, right? We can say, well, it proves Jesus was God. Well, I mean, didn't Jesus already prove he was God? Like, didn't he walk on water? Didn't he raise people from the dead? Didn't he, he did a lot of things, right? I mean, if it took the resurrection for you to believe it, I mean, let me put it to you this way. There's still people who didn't believe it after the resurrection anyway, right? I mean, it says the Jews paid off the guards saying, don't tell anybody about what happened. Right? It's amazing. Okay. So, and in fact, to this day, this is so interesting to me. You know the holy fire that comes out of the sepulcher every Orthodox Easter, right? You know who holds the key to that sepulcher? A Muslim family. Okay? And the Jewish police every year search the sepulcher to make sure there's no matches, there's nothing that'll start a fire in there. Okay, and then they search the patriarch, and he has to go and he can't wear his festal thing. He only goes in with just a very light tonya. If you ever notice him, he's like in a pajama tonya, a white tonya just covers him, right? And they search him to make sure he doesn't have matches or anything to start this fire. Okay? Now, think about this. Every year this happens. And these soldiers, this soldier just searched the sepulcher, no matches. Searched the patriarch, no matches. He walks in and fire comes out. And the soldier is what? Still Jewish. And every year, the soldier, like if I was a soldier, I'd be like, well, dang, something just happened, right? But the guy's like, well, all right, we'll find it next year. We'll find the matches. Like, you're just like, are you not? So, I mean, it just goes to show you, right? If you're waiting for the miracle, miracles don't change people, unfortunately, right? Jesus rose from the dead and it still didn't really work. He raised people from the dead and they're like, oh, you're just Beelzebub, the prince of devils, right? People see the holy fire every year and then they still do whatever. Right? There are Jewish people and Muslim people who go get the candles and they go, look, a cool candle. And then you're like, you're putting the math together, it's just me. Okay, so what are we talking about? So the reason the resurrection is important, right? It's not just that it proves Jesus was God and all this, because that's, if you weren't going to believe it, you weren't going to believe it. It's important because it's what? It's my resurrection, right? And that's why in the icon of the resurrection, the original icon of the resurrection, it isn't just him rising out of the dead. That's actually a Western picture that we Copticized. That is not the traditional icon of the resurrection. The traditional icon, the Orthodox icon of the resurrection, is him holding Adam and Eve's hands, right? Because the important part of the resurrection is that he raised me with him, right? And sometimes icons we see of the resurrection aren't really the Orthodox. That's why it matters to me, right? Is that he raised me with me. Okay. All right, so the other perspective the disciples could have taken, right? I mean, they were in a lot of fear. They're scared of the Jews, right? They could have thought, look, if death has no power over us, then why are we scared? I mean, someone should ask the question, right? I mean, if Jesus really rose from the dead and he told us, he said, if you eat my body and drink my blood, I will raise you on the last day, right? So then why are we scared, okay? And why would we fear any man? Why would we fear the Romans or the Jews or any government or anybody? Right? I have nothing to fear. Okay? And that's why when we internalize the resurrection and we say Christos Anisti to each other enough times, we're like, wow, if this is real, if we really believe all these things, then we really have nothing to fear. There's nothing that could scare me in this world. Like my God overcame the undefeatable foe, right? And as I said in the sermon, that's David, right? And Goliath. Goliath is the undefeatable foe, right? And death is this undefeatable foe that he overcame. And so sometimes we kind of idolize the disciples, right? We're like, that's the apostolic church and the teachings of the apostles. And kind of not really, right? I mean, here they are, they just witnessed the resurrection and they're still scared of some Jews, right? Or what the Jews are going to do, put them out of the synagogue, right? And it's clear they were compromised, right? They weren't in a good place mentally, emotionally. I mean, you just saw the resurrection and you're still scared, right? And it's a state of weakness. So they're in a state of weakness and it's kind of pathetic, right? For them to witness the resurrection, hear about it from the Marys, and then still be scared like that is kind of pathetic, right? And so the first thing to learn is it's okay to be fearful, and it's okay to be pathetic, and it's okay to be worried, right? And weak and compromised. And if you see these things in yourself, don't be afraid, don't lose hope. The apostles, the great disciples who just witnessed the resurrection had the same feelings of being scared, right? Being weak and compromised and being fearful. And then Christ did something very beautiful. He says, instead of saying, which my parents would say, which is, what's wrong with you? You just witnessed the resurrection. He came and very nicely appears to them and he wants to reassure them. And he keeps appearing to them to reassure them. And he says, and they felt peace and joy. And when the first thing he said when he came in, he says, my peace be unto you. Right? So that's what he said. Peace be unto you. So when we see the disciples gathered like that, to us, what do we see? What do we see when the apostles and the disciples are gathered? We see the church. Right? To us, that's always a symbol of the church, whenever the apostles are together. And we see the church in a state of fear. And so we have to ask, is it fitting that the church be in a state of fear? Can the church ever be in a state of fear? Is it congruent with the concept of the church that it be in fear? Is it possible? Sure. The church can be in a state of fear. When? When Christ is not in its midst. When Christ isn't in the middle of the church, it will be in a state of fear and a state of weakness and a state of brokenness and a state of patheticness. Hi, Habib, have a seat. And it turns out that when you remove Christ from the church, anything will scare it. Anything will shake it, because Christ is the source and power of the church. And if you take him out of the church, when he's not in its midst, then the church becomes fearful. So let me ask you the question differently. Is it possible that the church be a place of people who are afraid to leave, who want to lock themselves in? They don't want to go outside because all the bad people are out there. Do we see that? Can we stay insulated and cocooned in our little churches and try to avoid the people that are out there that are scaring us, who are different than us, the sinners, the ones who want to corrupt our children? Does this sound familiar? Can the church become this ethnocentric community of scared people who just want to sit and be around people that they trust, that they know, and they don't want to be around the outsiders? And avoid contact? Yeah. And this is the way that Satan can keep us scared and hidden. And what's the problem with being scared of the Jews? Why is it a problem that the disciples were scared of the Jews? It's not just you shouldn't be scared. Come on, man. Be tough. Be a man. Why is it a problem that the disciples were scared of the Jews? Well, let me ask you something. If you're scared of someone, can you love them? Can you love someone you're scared of? So, don't you think that the disciples also kind of hated the Jews? They hated that they killed their master. They hated that they're being hunted down as criminals. Do you think they like them? And this state of not liking the Jews, not liking what they did to their master, not liking anybody, is dangerous to the disciples, to the disciples' spiritual life. It's not good for them to be cocooned and fearful of others, the bad people out there, untrusting of anyone that's not their kind, not their disciples. In fact, if you read the story of the church, right, who else were they very untrustful and unfearful of? St. Paul. The disciples didn't trust St. Paul at all. They didn't want him anywhere near them. He wasn't one of them. Right? It took a lot for St. Paul. In fact, St. Paul had to go away and preach elsewhere and do other things. And they're like, you weren't with him. You weren't one of us. You didn't walk with him like we did. Who are you? Right? And St. Paul had a tough time breaking in because he was an outsider. And he's a Jew. And he's like a super Jew. Right? He was like, Pharisee, son of a Pharisee. Like he's the real deal. And so, this sounds familiar, doesn't it? Is it possible for the one holy Catholic apostolic universal church to become a small group of people who are scared of what's outside? Yeah. And when does that happen? When Christ is not in our midst. Fearful of the unknown, hateful of people who aren't like us, we're untrusting to outsiders. They don't look like us, they don't talk like us, they don't act like us. And so the church can devolve from this universal missionary church that's supposed to be the light of the world, supposed to sing from a city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden, to a group of scared people sitting in a room with a door locked because I'm scared of the Jews that are out there. And you can replace Jews with anything that's not me, anyone different, anyone that looks different or talks different. And in this case, the church devolves into a cult. And when the church becomes a cult, one of the ways a cult controls people is it scares you of outsiders. It says there's us and them. You're with us. You're not with them. Right? And that's the way a cult can control people. Insiders versus outsiders, Americans versus Egyptian, Orthodox versus anyone else. Protestants, heaven forbid, Catholics, Eastern Orthodox. You say it with enough anger, people are like, oh, not them, anything but them. Right? In fact, it's very interesting when His Eminence, Metropolitan Serapin, started the American churches, a lot of people wanted to call them missionary churches. In fact, that's what they're called in like some other states, I think like in DC or maybe Chicago. It's called a missionary church. And he refused that title. And he basically said that all our churches should be missionary churches, right? We should all be set on a hill, a city set on a hill. We should all be the light of the world. None of the churches should be little insulated, ethnocentric, Egyptian enclaves where we eat food that we know and we talk to people that we know and speak in languages. We should all be the Holy One, Catholic, Apostolic, Orthodox Church that's universal, that spreads to everywhere. Right? There's no church that's supposed to be insulated like this. So then what's the solution? The gospel is clear. They were scared of the Jews. And then when they saw Jesus, they were what? Filled with peace. And they got courage. And they went out and they preached everywhere. And you couldn't shut them up. Right? You couldn't stop them. In fact, they'd say, if you don't stop talking, we'll kill you. And they're like, who cares? Right? I'm not scared of death. Death has been conquered. So nothing scared them. And that's why when you look at the pre-post of Christ appearing, it's amazing, right? The pre is pretty pathetic, right? They all fled, they all ran, they all denied, they all did all the things they did. And then post, we have 11 of the 12 dying as martyrs. Right? Absolutely nothing will stop us. In fact, St. Thomas died as a martyr in India. He started the Indian Orthodox Church. He took the gospel all the way to India, and there's still an Indian Orthodox Church, which, by the way, is associated with the Coptic Church. So there's two families of Orthodoxy, Chalcedonian and non-Chalcedonian. We're part of the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox. The Indian Orthodox is one of the non-Chalcedonian Orthodox Church. Yeah, Thomas.
How the British took Christianity over when they conquered?
Oh, no, this is well before. Indian Orthodoxy has been around well before the British.
So there was Indian Christian sects.
Absolutely.
In India before.
St. Thomas is the one who started that church. In fact, when we call him, a doubting, there's an expression, a doubting Tom, right? It comes from doubting Thomas. The Indian Orthodox, they really don't like when we say doubting Thomas. Because they're like, what do you thought? Thomas is a hero to them. St. Thomas is like the man, like St. Mark to us, Whereas, and other people say, well, St. Mark, isn't he the guy that took off and fled and was scared and didn't want to, do stuff, and St. Paul didn't like him, and we're like, no, that's St. Mark, that's our guy, he's the best, right? So to the Indians, St. Thomas is like that, right? Every time anyone talks trash about St. Thomas, they get upset. So I'm just letting you know, don't talk trash. All right, so the church can be in one of two states. Christ in our midst. Christ not in our midst. We're in a state of fear, a state of hiding, a state of insulating ourselves from others, a state of isolation, hatred, mistrust of outsiders, In this case, we're working as a cult to create division between us and outsiders. And that's what we do. We insert seeds of distrust. Don't trust those people out there. Whoever the Muslims, the Americans, name the group, the gays, whatever, right? Or the other outcome is Christ is in our midst. And if Christ is in our midst, then there's joy and peace. There is no fear. There's bravery. And there's a desire to leave the room that you're locked in, go out and preach to everyone, Christ is risen. He has trampled down death by death. He has conquered the enemy. There is nothing to fear. Right? And then the gospel today or on Sunday will say the disciples were overjoyed. Right? They got a shot in the arm and they're like, we're ready to go out. And so Christ has to be the center of our community. As he said about himself, I'm the cornerstone of the church. He's the one that ties us all together and then ties all of us to heaven. And if the Christ isn't the center of the church will implode. And he said that. He said, once the shepherd, you strike the shepherd, the sheep will scatter. Right? Which is what you see, right? If you ever, I don't know if you guys ever dealt with sheep, right? But you put like 20 sheep on a mountainside, no shepherd, and you walk away and then you leave and you come back the next day, you won't find any sheep, right? Everyone's gone somewhere, right? Because they need a shepherd to follow. And we're like that as people. We just naturally scatter. Everyone kind of does their own thing and thinks everyone else is stupid, right? And everyone's got it right and everyone else has got it wrong. I have it right, I have it right and everyone else has it wrong. And so, we don't want to talk about the apostles, we want to talk about us. And I want to think about myself and the church and think about it practically. How do we keep Christ in our midst? How do we keep our shepherd in the middle of our flock? And this is clearly his will. And so how do we bring him in? And there's so many ways. We've heard so many sermons and lessons and talks about keeping Christ as the center. But let's go back to Thomas, and I'll offer one option. I want to focus on Thomas. Thomas wasn't as scared as the others, because the others locked themselves in a room. He wasn't scared. He was out and about. Just walking around. It's not that he had faith. He just had no hope. He was over it. He was like, you know what? If they find me, I'll be like, yeah, he was a fraud. Whatever. I'm over it. But then Christ came and he touched Thomas. Right? And he let Thomas touch him. And now whether or not actually Thomas put his hands in the fingerprint, in the nail prints, the gospel doesn't say. So we actually don't know if he actually did it, because Jesus reached out and said, hey, you want to touch? And it doesn't say that he did. I mean, you'd kind of be like a real, let me touch, and it's like, bro, he came all the way over, right? The least you can do is have some respect. But we don't know if he touched or not. And he had touched Christ before, right? He touched him as a teacher, as a prophet, as a miracle worker. But now he touched him as the resurrected Christ. And it was different. Because now he touched the body that overcame death. And now Thomas was resurrected. Thomas resurrected from his sin, his lack of faith, his lack of hope, his lack of belief. He just touched the body that had been resurrected. And so I want to speak about this touch. And what happens when we touch Christ. So it isn't by chance that Thomas wasn't there when the Lord appeared to the others. In fact, it was good that he wasn't there. It was good because doubt started growing in him. And for some of us, that's the path we have to take. Some of us have to take the path of doubt. And that's okay. It happened to Thomas, and he's a good guy too. Right? One of the ancient Christian writers wrote, "This was also a work of divine economy, that the absence of Thomas became a cause of full assurance and certainty. For if Thomas were present, he would not have doubted. And if he had not doubted, he would not have curiously sought. And if he had not sought, he would not have touched. And if he had not have touched, he would not have proclaimed him Lord and God. And if he had not called Christ Lord and God, then we would not have been taught to call him so. In fact, Thomas was the first one to say, my Lord and God. So his path was a path of doubt. And he ended with, my Lord and my God. So many of us try to examine Christ in a lot of detail to try to remove doubts from our lives. And I want to read you something. And so the question is, how do we do this? How do we touch Christ? I want to read you something from Father Matthew the Poor. He writes, he says, if you want to have understanding and spiritual awareness, where does that come from? Where does it come from to get spiritual awareness and understanding? And this is really important, and I want you guys to listen to this. He says, you have to stand before God and say, I don't understand. Help me understand. Say, I don't know. Help me know. You are the Word of God. So who can possibly understand you other than you? So we start praying and we ask God to reveal himself. And he basically said, look, I didn't go to seminary. I didn't read books. I didn't go to classes. So you teach me. And I come to you with an open heart. And you come to him with an open heart and he will teach you what you need to know. Prayer shows us all things. And you say, make me know. And read his words and his thoughts. Read and listen to the words and let it ring in your heart and your ears. And after a while, you'll find that the words entered your heart and not your mind. And he basically says, look, where is this verse found? Like someone will quote a verse. And he'll say, I have no idea. Matthew, Mark, Luke, St. Paul. I don't even remember where the verse is. He's like, I don't remember the references. I didn't study the books. I didn't study commentaries. He's like, but I know that verse. That verse is in my heart. I've fed on that verse. I've eaten from that verse. I've drunk from that verse. That verse fills me. I don't know where it is in the Bible, and it doesn't really matter. And he said, if you read to understand, you will understand. But if you read in order to learn, you'll never understand. Say it again. If you read to understand, you will understand. But if you read to learn and to know things, you'll never understand him. And he who understands can teach, but he who just knows and learned can't teach. So many people speak and teach and get theological degrees, certificates. Then when you listen to them, you don't understand. They're just saying stuff. Up here, some theoretical stuff that they read in a book. And then you can hear a simple monk or a youth or a child or a lay person and your heart becomes like fire. Why? Where did it come from? It comes from the Spirit. And the Spirit gives that understanding. That's the touch, right? And so what he's basically saying is we ask God and God gives. And that's always the right approach. I really need to work on the sermon because it's just a mess right now. All right. Okay, I'll read you another quote. Christ does not bring us philosophical teachings or sayings or promises or advice from God. He brings us the nature of the fatherhood of God itself, revealed, personified, active, visible, tangible, and comprehensible. In love for the weak, not in words, but in self-giving unto death. In mercy for sinners, not in words, but in sacrifice unto the shedding of blood. In forgiveness and pardon, not in words, but in putting on a garment of suffering for us, and bearing hardship in our place unto the curse that was the cross, and a life of power that overcame the tomb, and the unknown torments of hell, to raise the dead to life, even though they be rotten and decayed. All right. So the last thing I'll talk about is this concept of faith and investigation. And I'll talk about something cultural in our culture that I've actually come across 5 times this last week, which is this idea of not challenging authority, right? In our upbringing, right, in Egyptian culture, whoever is in authority is not to be challenged. Right? So say you have a boss. Boss is an idiot. Boss doesn't know what he's doing. Everyone in the office knows the boss is an idiot, right? But he's the boss. So you just say, Hadir, right? And in fact, your parents will tell you, just say Hadir, right? But I don't agree with you. I don't care. Say Hadir. But can we have a discussion? No, you say Hadir. Okay, but I don't really feel Hadir. I don't care. Say Hadir. Hadir. Okay, good. Now we have an understanding. Right now, to an American mind, that doesn't make any sense, right? Well, we should be able to have a discussion, right? If I'm learning to be a doctor and I'm watching my attending do something and I say, hey, why'd you do it like this? Right? The attending isn't going to get upset. He's going to say, are you challenging my authority? No, he's going to say, oh, I did it like this because this is this and this is this. And maybe he's like, well, couldn't we have done it like that? Oh, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe we could do it like that, right? It's okay to ask a question, but you're not allowed to ask a question of someone in authority. And we see this, unfortunately, right? We see this with older people. We see this with clergy, right? You're not supposed to ask the clergy a question, right? Because he's a person of authority. That's not true. That's cultural, right? That's not religious. That's just the way things are done there. And so oftentimes when we ask questions of our parents, I don't know if God exists. How could you say that? Well, I just did. Right? It's okay for me to say that. It's okay for me to ask that question. Right? And sometimes these questions are stomped and we're not supposed to think these things or say these things. But of course, the American mind does. Every mind does, but in some cultures that's repressed. So what I would say is our faith doesn't fear investigation. If you have a question, ask. Right? If you have disbelief, ask God to give you belief. Right? Read, learn. There's nothing to hide. Right? And the church isn't threatened when you're like, I don't know if this is right. Figure it out. Let's learn together. Right? And when we find people who are searching or questioning, which all of us are, but some of us do more so than others, right? We all have friends who are like, I'm over it. I'm done, right? I don't know if any of this is true. I don't know if any of this is real. How do I know Abuna knows what he's talking about? How do we're not making all this up? Okay, let's ask those questions. Those are fine to ask. We should be patient with those people. We shouldn't demonize them as our culture has demonized them. We shouldn't follow in the footsteps of that culture, right? We should love them. Okay? And we shouldn't reject them. And amid their doubts, there should be a good disbelief. We should all have a good disbelief. And they may have good intentions. They may have great hearts. They may be seeking the truth. And they're just very honest about their journey. And through good behavior, patience, gentleness, we can win them to Christ. So our faith doesn't fear this investigation, right? Christ is truth with a capital T. The more he's investigated, the more he shines. And so let's simply invite people to the Lord, right? Instead of trying to prove God to them, trying to convince them, shame those who don't believe what we believe, attack those who don't believe what we believe, right? And that's what Jesus did to Thomas. Did he once shame him? He said, come here, reach your finger in my side. You want to touch? Touch. You want to see? See. No, it's okay for you to ask these questions. It's okay for you to have disbelief. I'm not going to shame you. In fact, I will appear again just for you. All right? And I will go to wherever you are. I will find you where you are. And I'll say, here you go. Is this what you wanted to see? Is this what you want to touch? Do you have any other questions? There's nothing to fear. No, I'm not going to attack you. How, after all these years I was with you, Thomas, how could you No. That's stuff our parents say. That's not stuff Jesus says, right? And so if Thomas was in our community and said, you know what, I'm not hanging out with you guys. I'm gone. I'm going to take a walk. I'm out of here. I'm going to go find myself. What would our community do to Thomas? They'd go after Thomas, right? We'd judge the crap out of Thomas. We'd talk about Thomas. We'd even hate Thomas because he betrayed us. He went to that other church. He left us. He's Protestant now, right? And we would, right? Worst people, right? And we would attack and shame and cancel and do everything we could to Thomas if he was in our community, if he was out finding himself, right? But the apostles didn't, right? When Thomas came back, they were so overjoyed and they couldn't wait to tell him Jesus came. We've been praying for you this whole time. We love you. Come back, right? They didn't ostracize him. They didn't say, oh, you're going to leave? You're going to walk? All right, leave. Forget you. You're not one of us. We're a cult. We're all about being insulated and just people that talk like us and think like us. In fact, they did the opposite. Right, so what Christ did for Thomas was perfect. He let him experience him. Right? Come see. Come touch. We don't fear investigation. Right? David in the Psalm says, come and taste and see that the Lord is good. Taste and see that the Lord is good. I don't need to convince you. I don't need to intellectually talk to you about it. I don't even need to intellectually talk to you about the resurrection. Right? The resurrection is something we internalize. Right? It becomes a part of us. And then once this becomes so a part of us, right? Then we say with St. Paul, for me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Everything becomes Christ, right? And that's what happens when we touch Christ. I think I'll end there. Anybody have any questions? Comments? Criticisms, complaints, conundrums, qualms? Yes?
You know when you were saying, like, can you love someone you're scared of? Could you explain the fear of God?
Well, that's a good. So, I mean, the fear of God is, again, we have words in the Bible because we're using words to describe God, right? And so the fear of God can't be the fear of like an animal that's scared of its master, that it's going to beat it, right? The fear of God is a reverence, is an awe, right? So, worship God in fear and trembling, that's an awe of God, right? Of his power, which I imagine if any of us saw any of it, right? Like the transfiguration, right? You get this little glimpse of it. That's fear and awe, right? But then you have the other side, like St. Anthony has this quote where, a thing where he tells his disciples and he says, I no longer fear God. And they said, Father, Abba, this is a hard saying to hear. And he says, because I love him, the love has cast out the fear, which is what St. John says in his epistle. So, all of these things happen at the same time, right? So you imagine a father and a son, and you're not scared of your father, but you have an awe and a reverence towards your father. There's something to it, right? I actually, Amba Serapion to me is such a father and such a Christ figure that he actually elicits that response to a lot of people. Like, I mean, there's people like, oh, I don't like him, whatever, right? But to me, he's like, there's a fear of him. I'm not scared of him, right? But I there's a reverence towards him. Like, he has a presence about him that isn't fearful, like scary, but there's a reverence to him, a presence that you feel. Does that explain anything?
Yeah, thanks.
Yes.
Is there any advice or anything to say to someone that is trying to get to that like knowing instead of understanding, or is it just like literally leave them alone, don't talk to them about it?
I mean, yeah, like if someone's in that place, I mean, they're just learning and reading and like they want to know.
Yeah, they kind of want it to be done logically.
Yeah.
They'll have conversations. They're open to hearing about it. They're not disrespectful or combative.
Yeah.
Also, like they're looking for it to be proven.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like they're kind of in an atheist world, and they're
More agnostic of just
of
like,
not-
there's a higher
yeah.
power, but like nothing's been proven for me to like invest
Sure.
in faith kind of.
let them find it. You're not going to convince them, And the best you can do is love them and be loved to them. Be patient with them, and accept them. Accept them as people, and God finds them. If they're earnestly seeking, God finds them, for sure. Maybe not when they're 20, 30, 40, 50. Yeah, by the time they're 70, God finds them. There's no rush. Good. Any other questions, comments?
Do you have time for another question?
I do.
You do?
What time is it?
8:10.
Is it?
Yeah.
Okay, last question.
No, it's fine. I'll ask it later. It's okay.
All right. Sorry. Glory be to God forever. Amen.